Hi everyone, I'm Marcus Voss from AXO, and today, as an introduction to the domain of architecture and design, I'm going to tell you what architecture actually is. We start by noticing that architectures can be totally different. We see a castle on the top left, a high-rise office building in London on the right, and a couple of tents in the middle. And why are the different buildings so totally different? Well, that depends above all on the particular goal that is being pursued. For example, the castle, we see several rings of walls, the inner ones higher than the outer ones, and within the walls, defense towers, etc. So what is the goal that is pursued with this architecture? Sure, defense. Defense is the architectural goal, and a castle looks the way it does, precisely to achieve or support that architectural goal. The walls must be overcome by attackers. In the process, they also have to fight their way up, which is particularly exhausting. And from the defense towers, the defenders can fight the attackers particularly effectively, etc. Or the office tower in London. Does a high-rise building with offices where people work always have to look like this, or are there other reasons for such fancy architecture? Here again, it is quite clear that the aim here is also to impress. That is quite obviously an essential goal of this architecture. And here, with the tents, is there also a reason here why they are built like this and not differently? Of course, tents usually have this or similar architecture because it's all about mobility. That is the architectural goal. The tents have to be able to be taken down quickly and put up again at another location. And what we see. The respective architectural goal is accompanied by very typical types of components and how they are put together. Architecture therefore means achieving certain goals by using certain types of components and specific arrangements of these in relation to one another. And that brings us close to a definition. That will come in a moment. But first, let's look at another example. This is the Notre Dame Cathedral in Reims, France. The building is called cathedral because it is a bishop's seat, and there is the bishop's chair, the cathedra. Architecturally, however, it is a so-called basilica, or more precisely, a cross-form basilica. A cross-form basilica always looks like this or something similar. On the one hand, it has the typical cross-like ground plan, and on the other hand, the typical west-east orientation. And you can find in the architecture now again the typical components and their arrangement. The main aisle and the side aisles together form the nave. The transept crosses the nave, leading to the cross shape. The crossing is where both come together, and in the eastern part, then on the one hand the choir room, and, as a conclusion, the apse. And just the fact that there are names for all these parts shows how well defined this architecture is. Of course, also because this is widespread. After all, there are thousands of buildings of exactly this type. But Notre Dame de Reims is not just a basilica. It is one of the most important Gothic cathedrals in France. What does that mean, Gothic, or what is typical of Gothic architecture? The picture shows, highlighted in red, the typical elements and their typical arrangement. On the one hand, there are the well-known pointed arcs, for example, on the pointed arch windows, then the typical ribbed vaults with cross-shaped ribs that come together at the so-called keystone, or shown on the left, the typical flying buttresses of externally attached buttress arches that transfer the load of the structure outward to the buttresses, and on top of the buttresses the typical pinnacles as decorative elements. So what is shown here in red are again the types of components typical of the architecture and their typical arrangement. And now, of course, the question is again, why? Why exactly like this and not differently? Why exactly these types of components in these specific arrangements? And even if some of them have only an aesthetic purpose, such as the pinnacles, pointed arches, ribbed vaults and buttresses, have a very special effect. It is statically possible to minimize the wall areas and in return to maximize the window areas. And this has one main effect. It becomes brighter. Much more light enters the interior. And in fact, at some point in the Middle Ages, architects switched to this architecture precisely because it supported them in achieving this architectural goal. And with that, we now know everything we need to define the important terms we will work with below. First, architecture. Architecture is the fundamental organization of a system, reflected in the types of components and their relationships to each other, or in the way they interact. This is my definition based on the IEEE 1471 standard. The arrangement of the components in general can be about static aspects, but also about behavioral aspects, hence the extension to include the form of interaction of the components. Good architecture, as I said, has a number of goals that it helps to achieve. And architecture embodies the principles for the design of a system. That means it is about the design principle, not about all the details of the design. And then other terms. An architectural style manifests itself in a set of architectures similar in their characteristic features. Example: Gothic architecture in general. Reference architectures are given or known architectures that can or should be reused because they have already proven useful. Example: Gothic again, but for example in the sense of early Gothic architecture, for example Saint-Denis, as a reference for the architects of the High Gothic, for example Rheims, who could use it as a guide to achieve the associated architectural goal of more light. Architectural patterns are small architectures, consisting of a few types of components and relationships that solve recurring local problems. For example, the pattern flying buttress consisting of an outside arch plus a buttress, or the pattern ribbed vault consisting of ribs plus the keystone. Architectures or reference architectures can be understood as a specific collection of patterns. This relates these two terms to each other. Example: Gothic reference architecture includes the patterns flying buttress, ribbed vault, etc. And architectures or reference architectures can be combined if necessary. Example: Gothic plus cross-shaped basilica equals Gothic cross-shaped basilica. And with these definitions, we now organize the terms and task areas into the following scheme. On the one hand, there is the task area of the requirements. Here one differentiates frequently the functional and the non-functional requirements. In reality, this distinction is not always clear, or depends on the respective viewpoint. Here in the example, one can assign this, however, completely well. A requirement such as, I would like to have a new church in which the congregation can come together and pray, is more functional. That is, it relates to the core function of the new building, namely, coming together and being able to pray. Rather non-functional is the second requirement, which is added, and I want it to be brighter than before. In this example, that is our architectural goal, and the example is meant to illustrate that architectural goals or architectural requirements are often more non-functional requirements. When we talk about the architecture of software solutions in the next video, this will become even clearer. With these requirements, the next task is to define the general architecture for a solution that meets the requirements. Here, one does not usually start from scratch, but rather the well-known architecture styles, reference architectures, and architecture patterns usually come into play. Which of them support me in achieving exactly the required architectural goals? In our example with "it should be brighter than before," for example, Gothic architecture would be a good choice. As stated in the definition of architecture, this establishes the principles for the design of the solution, that is, the new church. The subsequent task of the specific design now completes all details within the framework of these principles. That is, with reference to our example, among other things, exactly how long and wide the individual areas of the basilica are to be laid out, exactly how many columns, lancet windows, ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, etc. are to be built, etc. This is how the concrete expression of the general architecture, in our case the concrete specific design of the Cathedral of Rheims, is created. Up to this point, everything was just planning. And now the fourth task is the actual implementation, the step where the actual solution or the concrete system is actually created. In our example, the real existing Cathedral of Rheims. This pattern applies to architecture in general. And the middle two task areas encompass the core processes of what we understand to be the domain of architecture and design. And in the next video, we'll transfer this very pattern to software and use it to look at what software architecture is. Until then.